What is a video game? Anyone familiar with the last 50 years of game academia or predecessors thereof is probably familiar with the disparate attempts at answering this question. The interdisciplinarity of the field meant that even when tackling a different specific topic, many books and articles found themselves with the difficult onus of having to define what exactly were these video games they were talking about. Especially when previous attempts at defining play, such as Huizinga's Homo Ludens or Suits the Grasshopper, were not entirely fitting for the modern concept of game as a specific digital artifact. What I'm trying to ask here though is not the well-known question of how we define the wider concept of game or the wider concept of play, but something less trodden, something related to the aforementioned specificity of modern ludic artifact. What makes a specific game, or better, what makes a single video game title a specific instance of a video game different from other video games? Why are Tomb Raider and Final Fantasy VI not the same game? How can we identify them as two different games which convey different meaning when experienced? It seems like a banal question, but it might not be as straightforward as it seems. Is it the specifics of the source code, taken word by word? One would think so, but there are edge cases. The source code for the original Kingdom Hearts was entirely lost, and when the game was ported to modern consoles, it had to be rewritten from scratch. One might consider these two games, which share the Kingdom Hearts name, to be entirely different games, but after all, they share pretty much the same themes, story, affordances, and so on. They're pretty much the same experience, the only thing they do not share is their source code. We can then assume that it's neither as simple as looking at the title, meaning the name that was given to the specific game. Many re-releases of the same game feel generally free to add new words and denominators to the original title for emphasis sake or for marketing. We may then look solely at the story and themes, but of course the same story can be transposed in different ways. So we may then look at film, which in pop culture is of course the closer media to video game that we can find, where in film this distinction seems more clean-cut. A film is a series of visual frames in a specific order synced with an audio track. In this case, what is shown on screen and the order in which it's shown is a pretty catch-all identifier for a singular piece of cinema. In games, this doesn't work, as the interactivity of the medium makes it so that generally each player will see a different series of visual frames in a different order during their personal playthrough. Pinning interaction as the key difference from the filmic medium, we can then look at the possibility space of the interactivity that the game affords the player as a key identifier of the singular meaning conveyed by the singular artifact. But this also doesn't really work, as games in the same genre often rely on almost identical modes of interaction, with plenty of game systems becoming canonized and ported from game to game. We know that Dark Souls and The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild are different games, with wildly different tones, wildly different conveyed meanings, yet the possibility spaces offered by their systems are very similar. In both of these games, you can fight using different weapons, you can walk around 3D environments, you can store items in an inventory, you can engage in crafting of new pieces of equipment, and so on. What are we interested in then is not the wider possibility space of the system, but instead their minutiae, their implementation, and the context in which they are applied. In short, what makes a game truly different from another is not the wider range of interaction, but the intersection of its specific mechanical systems and the environment in which said systems are applied and used. These are the bases with which a game such as the forgotten 1998 RPG Robopon should be analyzed. Developed by Hudson Soft at the same time as they were working with Creatures on the Pokemon trading card game digital adaptation, and released during the height of the international Pokemon craze, Robot Ponkottsu, literally meaning junk robots or useless robots, It's a game that it is hard to describe in any other way than a complete one-to-one tracing of Pokemon Red and Green's concept and mechanics. From the narrative to the battle system, from the terminology to even the aesthetics of the interface, everything in Robopon seems to go to extreme lengths to reproduce as much as possible of the Pokemon games. While at the time many studios tried to capitalize on the collectible monster genre being at the center of the cultural zeitgeist, most of them did so through products that were well different from the originator of the craze, like the live sim-inspired Monster Rancher series or the ever-changing herald of weird aesthetics that was the Digimon cross-mediatic entity. All these games took the basics of the genre, meaning the concept of an RPG where instead of having a fixed party, the player could collect and upgrade a series of uniquely characterized monsters, and went at it from radically different angles, making for games which featured a surprisingly diverse array of mechanics and ideas. For instance, in Monster Rancher games there was no real adventuring, and the core mechanic was a scheduling system which made those games much more similar to Princess Maker or Harvest Moon than to any RPG. Standing at the diametric opposite side of these games is Robopon, which looks and plays exactly like Pokemon, often to an eerie degree. As the game starts, the player is presented with an opening screen and subsequent menus that are pretty much identical to the one in Pokemon Red and Green. This continues in the opening sequence, and the sprite, the composition of the protagonist's house, and the general premise are all taken almost directly from Pokemon. The intro even features the nowadays mimetic concept of an old mentor figure forgetting the protagonist's name as a narrative framing for the player inputting their name. Robopon is set in a world where humans coexist with Robopons, living beings in between robot and animal, which often have uncanny powers and abilities. Humans can capture these Robopons by using magnets, and once they have captured them, they can use them for tasks such as transportation or more often Robopon fights. The player plays as a kid who, after receiving their first Robopon, decides to adventure through the world, defeating the 7 best Robopon battler in order to become the #1 Robopon legend, a title which benefits are never fully explained in the game. To accomplish this goal, the player will have to explore 2D environments through an overhead visual and battle the Robopon using a turn-based system, which involves Robopon facing each other in 1 vs 1 battles, and allows the player to order the Robopon to use a variety of attacks, use healing items, and exchange the Robopon for another one of the 4 Robopon they can bring with them. New Robopons are acquired by weakening wild Robopons during battles and then using a specific magnet item, which will have a higher chance to turn the wild Robopon to their side the lower their health is. Additionally, as Robopon win battle, they will gain experience, allowing them to increase in level, therefore increasing the statistical values used to determine the effectiveness of their attacks. As a separate reward, winning battles also grants the player energy balls, a resource stored in the Robopon themselves, which can be spent to make some Robopon evolve into stronger forms. Anyone even tangentially familiar with the Pokemon franchise will notice from this description just how similar Robopon is to its more successful inspiration. Which is what triggered my initial question: what makes a video game different from another? Is Robopon Pokemon? The mechanical, narrative, and aesthetical concepts that hold the game up are pretty much taken straight from Pokemon. So, if Robopon is Robopon and not Pokemon, what is it that makes them two distinct digital artifacts? Of course, I feel that the answer to that first question is that yes, Robopon and Pokemon are different games, and because of that, I find that rather than their similarities, what is really interesting about Robopon is all the different ways in which it differs from its inspiration, and how the small details in content and implementation make those general premises feel way different when you actually play the game. Both Robopon and Pokemon are results not only of the collectible monster craze sprung by the latter, but also of the specific style of Japanese RPGs their handheld console like the Game Boy seemed to foster. Before Robopon and before Pokémon, many other games were released on the Game Boy which, while lacking the core collectible monster mechanics, dealt in slightly non-linear adventuring and abstracted settings in the same way that the two collectible monster games did. Games like Makai Toshi Saga and Gargoyle's Quest hold more similarities than one would expect to games like Pokémon, featuring very similar progression structure, meaning vaguely open worlds with very defined narrative objectives and complex flagging that stops the player from getting to them right away, and a very similar weirdness in the narrative, as the limited resolution of handheld consoles meant that those games had very little space for expository text, as the text boxes could only fit so many characters, leaving many details of those games' world necessarily unexplained. Robopon, if anything, leans in those genre conventions even harder than Pokémon did. Where Game Freak with Pokémon would often prefer to use the limited amount of characters available to their NPCs to tutorialize thoroughly the mechanics at the core of the game, making for a very easy to follow but often quite dry experience, Robopon does no such thing, cutting almost every hint of tutorialization from the game. Most of the dialogue in Robopon is used to either convey narrative or for humorous purpose, with instances of NPCs explaining how the mechanics of the game actually work to the player being very few and far between. This means that while previous knowledge of Pokémon can certainly help to figure things out, a lot of the systems at the core of Robopon take a lot of trial and error to fully grasp, allowing the game to capture the mysterious aura of games like Saga a lot closer. This also means that the game has a lot more space to have fun with itself, which gives it a very clear tone set in absurdism and meta-commentary of the genre. Rather than practically explaining the game, the NPCs make jokes at the expenses of the composition of the environments, at the expenses of odd genre conventions, and many more things. While this tone is not exaggerated enough to classify Robopon as a straight-up parody of Pokémon, especially because many of its systems are presented at face value, the lack of tutorialization and overabundance of playful jokes definitely contributes to the overall tone of the game feeling pretty different despite the identical premises. Contributing to this further is the overall structure of the game. In Pokémon, the objective is to defeat 8 gym leaders. These gym leaders inhabit titular gyms located in different cities of the game world, and the game tends to funnel the player towards these places. No particular relevance is associated with these gyms. There are no cutscenes or extended pieces of dialogue dedicated to the 8 leaders. The player in fact proceeds through the game without any kind of constant narrative direction, and encountering a new gym is just used as a signifier that the player is making progress, rather than being part of a concrete narrative theme during the player adventure. Robopon effectively does the opposite. As each of the 7 legends the player has to face start their chapter with some sort of narrative cutscene hinting at their location. As the player reaches that location, they'll end up being involved in some sort of small plotline themed around the legend in question, which will involve a series of set pieces eventually climaxing in the final legend fight. For instance, both Pokémon and Robopon have a military-themed gym leader/legend. In Pokémon, before fighting him, the player will have to walk through a series of pleasant seaside roads to then reach the city where the gym is located. Then, after realizing that the gym entrance is blocked by a tree, they will need to explore a nearby cruise ship to obtain an ability which lets their Pokémon cut said tree, giving them access to the gym. As a stark contrast, in Robopon the player has to join the legend's private army, and climb 5 buildings while facing specifically themed challenge as they narratively rise up in the ranks of this army, eventually ranking high enough to be able to visit this general and challenge them to an official battle. While the building blocks of the games are quite similar, Pokémon Red and Green are often a dry experience that allows the player imagination to do more work than the game's text, easing the player into engaging with it in the way that's most comfortable for them. Robopon, on the other hand, is a loud cartoon, funneling the player through wacky adventures full of jokes and idiosyncrasies. The stark difference in tone, interestingly, is only due to some slight changes in structure and some small choices on how to use text real estate. Contributing to this tone is the lack of fully navigable roads between cities. While in Pokémon the exploration is seamless, as cities are connected by fully navigable roads, which transition into each other without loading screens often, Robopon does away with these and manages transitions between cities through a stylized map of the area. This contributes to the general detachment between the player and the experience. In Pokemon, the experience is centered on the player. There are few cutscenes, very few moments where the player is not in control, and the world is presented as a seamless continuum. In short, it tries to work in as many immersive elements as the limited hardware capabilities of the Game Boy allow. Robopon, on the other hand, is more impersonal, more focus is put on NPCs and more focus is put on narrative, and the world doesn't really exist outside of the places that are significant to its narrative. Another interesting feature which helps Robopon feel wackier and more varied is how battle will not always be based around combat. Aside from straight-up turn-based duels, the game will often frame fights around other three modes of fighting, which take the form of their own micro-games: strength testing, long jump, and racing. If I had to talk about this on a purely evaluative perspective, I could say that they are fairly unbalanced, and when the game starts to introduce them in dungeon, it just ends up making exploration longer and more tedious. But what is interesting about them is the intent, as allowing Robopon who are weakened in combat to still have a way to be useful through different types of competitions is something that plays into a wider attempt of Robopon to make their collectible monsters more memorable as individuals. This is also done by changing how traversal flagging is handled. In Pokemon, obstacles like trees and lakes are traversed through getting access to specific HMs. These are non-consumable items which can be used to teach traversal abilities to a vast number of Pokemon. This means that after obtaining the HM number 3, for example, containing Surf, the player will be able to teach this attack to most of the Water-type Pokemon they own, included some unexpected entries like the Earth-type Rhydon, and handily use them to get through bodies of water. Presenting once again a small change that results into a stark contrast in tone, Robopon instead makes these traversal abilities innate to some specific Robopon, to some specific creature. For instance, Cycle, the motorcycle Robopon, is the only one who can help the player traverse the dangerous desert, and upgrading it to a Speedy, the car Robopon, allows them to also traverse the sun waterfalls in said desert. This once again helps the singular monsters have more of a mechanical identity and be generally more memorable, and is complemented by the fact that in Pokemon you can give a name to any Pokemon you catch, right away, while in Robopon you can only unlock the name-changing feature through a specific optional quest. Collectible monster games that are not supported by any external media always seem to have a bit of trouble in making all their monsters feel endearing and interesting. Especially because when you have so many monsters to include in a game, you often don't really have the resources and effective design space to give all of them a unique narrative and or mechanical space. If I had to speculate, I would say that these small changes were an attempt at obviating this problem, giving more mechanical relevance to specific Robopon and forcing the player to learn each Robopon's name before renaming them to their content, in order to make the singular Robopon more memorable than they would normally be. Ironically though, a faux pas in that direction is the system through which Robopon learn attacks. While in Pokemon this system is quite simple, as Pokemon learn attacks as they level up, following a simple list that's specific for each Pokemon. In Robopon the monsters learn their attacks through a series of purchasable in-game accessories that have to be equipped to them, like equipment in a general fantasy RPG. These items can be combined to allow the Robopon to use combination attacks, for example, equipping a fire item and a water item, allow a Robopon to use the steam attack, as fire turns water into steam. And while this system is interesting in a void taken by itself, it certainly fails in making the Robopon feel unique, as any Robopon will pretty much be able to learn any attack, excluding specific instances. While in Pokemon one can be amused by details like the bad Pokemon Zubat being able to use the bug-type move Leech, despite being a flying poison type, because bats are known in folklore to suck blood, in Robopon this mechanical characterization doesn't exist. An effort to replicate the aforementioned Pokemon system is made, as some Robopon are able to equip only a subset of the total equipment available, but this ultimately doesn't really work, as it's a detail that is extremely hidden in the game's menu, and in fact it generally results just in poor user experience, as this information is not available when purchasing such equipment, only subsequently when trying to equip it. The type-based rock-paper scissors mechanic of Pokemon are also slightly twisted in Robopon. In the originator of the genre, every Pokemon has one or two elemental types associated to it, often quite evident from the visual design of the creature. For example, Ponyta, a horse engulfed in flame, is of type Fire. These types interact with each other in fairly easy to follow way. Fire attacks are strong against grass Pokemon, water attacks are strong against fire Pokemon, and so on. In Robopon, all of this still holds true, except for two details. Firstly, the visual design of the creatures is way less directly relatable to their typing. Sumito, a sumo wrestler-inspired Robopon, is of Thunder type, while Sunny, a sun-inspired robot, is of normal type rather than what may seem like it should be, which is Fire. Secondly, there are significantly fewer interactions between types than in Pokemon, clocking in at 47 interaction total against Pokemon Red and Green's 81. On a practical level, the result of that is that, while in Pokemon the typing system becomes an indispensable strategic advantage for the player to use, in Robopon the same system becomes almost irrelevant, as it's way more difficult to gauge which type a creature is visually, and it's way more difficult to come by this interaction casually, without the specific intent of triggering them, which in turn makes it more difficult to just learn this interaction and remember them. On a thematic level, it could be said that this helps to reinforce the thread of Robopon being singular characteristic beings, rather than a collection of type and stats, but I feel that the more relevant implication of the systems comes to play when we pair it with the overall combat mechanics. So as we get into specific systems behind the turn-based Robopon battling, it can be observed that while Robopon operates very closely to Pokemon, a small detail changes completely the tone of said battles. In Pokemon there are two types of attacks that Pokemon can learn: damaging moves and non-damaging moves. As the name implies, the former are moves which primary use is to deal damage to an opponent. This is done in order to reduce their health, which, as you may imagine, once reaches 0, it means that the opponent is defeated. The latter are moves that deal no direct damage, but have secondary effects, like lowering the opponent's statistical value temporarily. While there are plenty of competitively viable non-damaging moves, a lot of them, especially the ones that the NPCs carry, are generally quite weak, and are balanced to not be particularly effective in the game's battle economy. You may imagine that taking a whole turn to slightly lower an opponent's defense is generally less effective than taking a chunk of their opponent's health right away. What this means is that the player, especially in the early half of the game, will face a lot of enemies that have in their movesets these non-damaging moves, which basically means that the player can sometimes get what effectively are free turns, as the opponent uses non-damaging move on them. During these turns they do not receive any significant attacks, as they do not lose health, but at the same time they do not feel like the game is going easy on them, as the opponent is still doing something when they use these moves. This in turn means that the battle economy is a bit more lax than it would normally be, as resources like health and healing items are not as highly taxed, as not every turn of the battle economy means a decrease in health. Robopon has none of this, as every attack is effectively a damaging move. Sure, some of the moves have secondary effects that may randomly trigger, but as a general rule, everything a Robopon can do in battle deals damage to the opponent. The obvious consequence of this is that the game's resource economy is much more unforgiving, as even the most minor battles are difficult to exit unscathed. This, combined with the decreased relevance of typing mechanics, makes the battles feel overall less strategic, but also means that Robopon with innately high statistical values are much more relevant to a successful completion of the single-player experience. Where in Pokemon Red and Green with a bit of wit and planning one can finish the game with their favorite creatures, in Robopon getting those hidden high-statted monsters is almost necessary, unless the player is willing to spend a lot of time fighting random battles to raise the level of their monsters about what it normally would be. Which once again plays into the game's effort of characterizing singular Robopon more uniquely. Robopon is not necessarily a good game. In fact, Joshua Jankiewicz called it a bizarre and often awful monstrosity in his retrospective of the series published on Hardcore Gaming 101. But regardless of any qualitative analysis, what I find fascinating is how, even in a game that is trying extremely hard to be a one-to-one tracing of something else, Small choices in how the broad design is implemented and small choices in how the content is contextualized end up uniquely defining the tone and conveyed meaning of the game. I did not even go into what most people find neat about Robopon, like how it introduced an internal clock years before Game Freak would design a whole game around it in Pokemon Gold and Silver, or how the cartridge had an infrared receiver that was meant to allow for online functionality, but instead ended up being only used to open a couple of optional chests. All that stuff makes for interesting stories, but what I love about Robopon is that despite being a game that goes to extreme lengths to be Pokemon, taking its menus, taking its ideas, taking its assets, hell, even the number of creatures in Robopon is 150, the same as the number of Pokemon in Pokemon Red and Green if you exclude the event-only Mew. Despite all this effort, despite trying as hard as possible to be Pokemon, Robopon is not Pokemon. The fact that it is a game made by different people in a different time, making different choices in implementation, ends up making the play and tone feel radically different from the game that it was trying to rip off, reflecting instead more the sensibilities of its authors and its context. And to be honest, this is exactly what I find beautiful about media and what makes me excited about analyzing it.